Harry Houdini spent his career being chained inside locked trunks and dropped into rivers, buried alive, hung upside down in straitjackets above city streets, and he walked away from every single one of them. Then, in the fall of 1926, an unplanned punch to the stomach, a stunt he never trained for, never saw coming, ruptured his appendix and killed him within days. The man who mastered danger was destroyed by the one risk nobody, including him, was watching for. That contradiction is the entire argument of the book we're breaking down today. Morgan Housel, the author behind The Psychology of Money, a book that has sold more than 4 million copies worldwide, built his second masterwork on a strange premise. Instead of chasing what will change next, he studied what has never changed at all, across centuries of war, panic, greed, and reinvention. Inside the vault, we call this the forecasting trap, and today we dismantle it completely. 2 questions will follow you through this entire masterclass and only fully resolve in the final section. Why did Houdini's death come from something almost embarrassingly small after surviving the impossible? And why do markets, economies, and careers that feel the safest right before the moment they collapse the hardest? Stay close, because the answers change how you see risk forever. This is not a bedtime story about optimism, and it is not a lecture about doom either. Same as Ever is a strategic manual disguised as a collection of short stories, and by the end of this video, you will understand why prediction is a losing game, while pattern recognition is the closest thing to an unfair advantage that exists in money and in life. If any of this resonates, hit subscribe, because the book vault exists to hand ambitious people exactly this kind of leverage, week after week. The strategic breakdown, hanging by a thread. Now we step into the second case file of this investigation, the chapter Housel calls Hanging by a Thread, and it's where the Houdini idea gets its proof. Housel traces how a single overlooked decision made decades earlier by an ordinary person quietly rippled forward until it altered the outcome of a major historical event nobody could have predicted from the starting point. Same invisible mechanic that killed Houdini, just playing out on the scale of nations instead of one man's body. Most people listening right now believe they can spot the next big shift coming, in markets, in their industry, in their own career. But deep down, you already know the biggest moments of your life were not the ones you planned for. This is where mainstream advice collapses, because mainstream advice keeps selling you 5-year plans and 10-year forecasts as if the future owes you a straight road. Housel's entire argument is that it does not, and that the smartest operators stop trying to predict the unpredictable and instead build lives that can absorb the shock of it. The psychology here is what makes it dangerous. The more confident an expert sounds about tomorrow, the more our brains want to trust them, even though confidence and accuracy have almost nothing to do with each other. Nobody in 1965 predicted the specific chain of events that would define the following decade, yet historians now describe that decade as though it were obvious all along. Hindsight is quietly rewriting the past to make the present feel more certain than it ever actually was. Late at night, when the noise finally goes quiet, a small voice creeps in, doesn't it? A voice that asks whether you're behind, whether everyone else got a memo you missed. Housel would tell you that voice is lying. Nobody got the memo. The people you admire most were also improvising, reacting to accidents, adjusting in real time, not executing some flawless plan they'd locked in from the start. If history is as fragile, this dependent on tiny accidents nobody sees coming, the entire idea of safety needs to be rebuilt from scratch. You can't predict the thread that breaks the system. So the only rational move left is learning to see the fracture before it snaps. Which brings us back to Houdini and to the blind spot nobody trains for, the risk you never see coming. Remember that punch. Housel builds an entire chapter around it called Risk is What You Don't See, and its argument is bigger than one magician's death. Most people think danger looks like the thing everyone is already talking about, the headline risk, the obvious threat. In reality, the risks that actually destroy portfolios, careers, and companies are almost never the ones circled in red on the calendar. Housel argues the biggest risk is always the one nobody is discussing, precisely because it hasn't happened recently enough for anyone to be afraid of it. If you leave with nothing else from this video, remember that comfort is not evidence of safety. It's often the exact opposite. This connects directly to a companion chapter, Calm Plants, The Seeds of Crazy, where Housel draws on the work of economist Hyman Minsky, who argued in the 1960s that stability itself is destabilizing. On the Rational Reminder podcast, Housel explained that when recessions stop happening, people rationally grow optimistic, take on more debt, and stretch further than they should, which quietly manufactures the very instability that eventually breaks the system. Calm doesn't prevent the crash. Calm is the incubator that grows it. Here's the analogy that makes it click. Tire companies test a new tire's limits by putting it on a car and running it until it physically blows up, because there's no other honest way to know where the breaking point actually is. Markets do the same thing to investors, quietly probing for the exact level of pain people can endure before they panic and sell. Every long period of calm you're enjoying right now is secretly running that same test on you. This is where most people destroy their own financial future, by mistaking a quiet season for a permanent one. Most never notice the pattern until the pain has already arrived. Once you accept that calm is temporary by design, you stop building your life around the assumption that today's stability will simply continue, and you start building margin instead, on purpose, before you're forced to. The expectations trap. Now the investigation turns inward in the chapter Housel calls expectations and reality, and it's the one that explains why safety collapses even when nothing external actually changes. His argument, happiness is never a function of your actual circumstances. It's a function of the gap between what you expected and what you actually received. Two people with identical bank accounts can live in completely different emotional realities, depending entirely on what they quietly believed they were owed. Picture a 1950s American suburb, nearly every house on the block roughly the same size, the same car in the driveway, the same appliances in the kitchen. Expectations stayed anchored close to reality simply because nobody had much to compare themselves against. Now picture a phone lighting up with someone else's highlight reel every 90 seconds. That's the shift Housel points to. Social media doesn't change what you have. It changes what you think you're supposed to have, and it inflates the gap no amount of money can close. Most people listening right now believe more income will finally fix the restlessness they feel. But deep down, you already suspect the last raise didn't fix it, and neither will the next one, because the target keeps moving exactly as fast as your income does. That thought feels almost insulting to hear. Though once you accept it, you realize you have far more control over your own happiness than any employer, market, or bonus structure will ever give you credit for. Housel calls the companion idea overnight tragedies and long-term miracles. Heart disease deaths have fallen roughly 70% since the 1950s, a genuine miracle, but it happened so slowly nobody ever felt it as one. A market crash happens fast and loud, which is exactly why the world constantly feels more dangerous than the data says it actually is, even as most measurable outcomes steadily improve in the background. It's the same invisible fracture logic from Houdini's chapter, just running in reverse. Good news that never announces itself. If your happiness has always been a math problem about expectations rather than income, then every raise you've ever celebrated may have actually moved you further from contentment, not closer to it. That's not motivation. That's a mirror, and most people spend an entire career refusing to look into it. Why stories beat statistics. Think about the last can't-miss stock tip you heard from someone who wasn't a professional, a coworker, a cousin, a stranger online, absolutely certain, with a story that made total sense in 30 seconds. Maybe it was a company nobody had heard of 6 months earlier, suddenly everywhere, every group chat repeating the same 3 sentences about why this time was different. Nobody involved needed a spreadsheet to feel convinced. They needed a story that resolved their uncertainty faster than the facts ever could. That's the subject of the chapter Housel calls Best Story Wins, and his argument cuts against almost everything this niche is taught to believe. Markets aren't actually driven by statistics or probability tables nearly as much as we pretend. They're driven by whichever story about the future feels the most emotionally believable to the largest number of people at once, regardless of how accurate that story turns out to be. Ausland's companion chapter, Wild Numbers, explains why people crave certainty far more than they trust honest probability. A confident expert delivering a simple, satisfying narrative will consistently outpersuade a cautious analyst presenting accurate but messy statistical ranges, even when the cautious analyst is objectively closer to the truth. This is where mainstream advice collapses again, because most financial education teaches you to trust the numbers, when the real skill is learning to notice which numbers are wrapped inside a seductive story. As author James Clear has put it, people follow incentives, not advice, which means the story that wins is rarely the most accurate one, is the one that best serves what the listener already wanted to believe or already had a financial stake in believing. That's not stupidity. It's a rational response to a brain wired to seek emotional resolution over statistical precision. Most people think they're immune to this, that they personally decide based on data, not narrative. But the moment a compelling story enters the room, the brain quietly starts hunting for statistics that confirm it, not statistics that challenge it. Inside the vault, we call this narrative capture, and it's the reason otherwise brilliant people still buy into bubbles, still chase trends at the exact wrong moment, still mistake conviction for accuracy. If the best story always wins, regardless of whether it's true, the sharpest competitive advantage available to you isn't being right first. It's staying skeptical the longest, especially when everyone around you sounds absolutely certain. That single discipline is the one habit almost every account of long-term financial survival in this book quietly circles back to. The price of thinking differently. We now arrive at the final and most personal case in this investigation. The chapter Housel calls Wild Minds, and it forces an uncomfortable question directly onto the viewer. Housel profiles figures like the military strategist John Boyd, the physicist Isaac Newton, the entrepreneur Elon Musk, and the marathon record holder Eliud Kipchoge, and argues that extraordinary outcomes almost never come from people who think, behave, or operate like everyone else around them. Standing out requires genuinely thinking differently, not just claiming to. Most people think this behavior is confidence. In reality, it is closer to obsession, because Housel is careful to note something most summaries conveniently leave out. The exact traits that make these figures extraordinary in one area of life often make them exhausting, difficult, or even damaging in others. Boyd's own colleagues described him as nearly impossible to work alongside, a man who could burn through friendships and marriages with the same intensity he brought to rewriting fighter-pilot doctrine. Kipchoge trains in a way most amateurs would call self-destructive, logging distances that would injure an ordinary runner within weeks. You cannot cleanly separate the intensity that builds a legendary career from the intensity that frequently strains relationships, health, and patience along the way. Greatness and difficulty, in Housel's telling, are rarely two separate ingredients. This connects to a companion idea Housel raises about scale, illustrated through a line attributed to Warren Buffett, that you cannot make a baby in 1 month by getting 9 women pregnant. Some processes cannot be compressed, no matter how much pressure, capital, or urgency you throw at them, which is exactly why Housel warns against the trap of too much, too soon, too fast. Ambitious people frequently destroy years of legitimate progress by demanding an outcome faster than the underlying process is capable of delivering it. Nothing is more persuasive than what you have personally experienced firsthand, and Housel builds this idea through the accounts of soldiers described by historian Stephen Ambrose, who wrote that there was no way training could prepare a man for combat. No amount of second-hand advice, however well-intentioned, can substitute for lived experience, which is precisely why hard financial lessons about risk and expectations rarely stick until you have personally felt the loss yourself, not just read about someone else feeling it first. If you leave with nothing else from this entire masterclass, let it be this: the wild minds who reshape industries and the ordinary investors who survive decades of market chaos are running the exact same operating system underneath, refusing to copy the crowd, refusing to demand speed the process cannot give, and trusting first-hand experience over second-hand certainty every single time. That operating system is not natural talent. It is a decision, available to you starting today, and it closes this investigation completely. Key lessons and insights. The forecast you should never trust. The first lesson this book teaches us, and perhaps the one every ambitious investor resists the longest, is what we call the forecast you should never trust. Confident predictions about markets, careers, and economies feel comforting, but confidence has never once been correlated with accuracy, and history keeps proving that the specific chain of events that shapes any decade is essentially unforecastable in advance. The practical move is simple. Stop asking what will happen next year and start asking what has never changed across every year that came before it, the invisible fracture rule. The second lesson this book teaches us returns to Houdini and to what we call the invisible fracture rule. Housel calls it risk is what you don't see. The threats that actually destroy careers, portfolios, and companies are rarely the ones everyone is already worried about. They are the quiet ones nobody's bothered discussing recently. Apply this by regularly asking yourself what risk currently feels too unlikely to plan for, because that exact question is precisely where your real vulnerability is most likely hiding, right now, unnoticed. The 2-number trick. The third lesson this book teaches us comes from the expectations chapter, and we call it the 2-number trick. Remember the question we opened with about why safety so often collapses the hardest right when it feels most secure? The answer lives partly here. Track two numbers honestly, what you actually have and what you secretly expected to have by now. Every time that gap widens, without you noticing, dissatisfaction grows quietly in the background, regardless of how much your income or net worth is genuinely improved. The story premium. The fourth lesson this book teaches us comes from Best Story Wins, and we call it the story premium. Before acting on any confident market narrative, ask whether you would still believe it if it were delivered in a boring, unemotional, statistical format instead of a compelling story. If the excitement disappears the moment the story does, inside the vault, we call that a warning sign, not an opportunity, and it deserves far more skepticism than your gut instinct will naturally want to give it. The weird tax. The fifth and final lesson this book teaches us comes from Wild Minds, and we call it the weird tax. It resolves the very first question this masterclass opened with. The reason Houdini's death felt so shocking is the same reason extraordinary outcomes always carry a hidden cost. Nobody advertises up front. Every genuinely exceptional result, in money or in life, charges what the vault calls a weird tax, paid in obsession, discomfort, or risk that looks irrational from the outside. Decide in advance which tax you are actually willing to pay. The vault closing. There's something quietly radical about a book that refuses to predict the future and instead spends every page studying what has always remained true underneath it. Housel is not handing you a forecast because he does not believe an honest one exists. Every forecaster in history has eventually been wrong about something, usually the thing that mattered most, and Housel is simply refusing to join a tradition built on that track record. He is handing you a filter instead, a way of separating the permanent forces of human behavior, fear, greed, storytelling, and expectation, from the constant noise of headlines desperately pretending that this particular crisis, this particular boom, has never happened before in exactly this shape. Here is your specific action for the next 7 days. Write down one financial or career decision you've been delaying because you are waiting for more certainty about the future. Then, ask yourself honestly which of this book's timeless forces, unrealistic expectations, a compelling but unproven story, or a hidden risk nobody is discussing is actually the real reason behind the hesitation. Naming the true force underneath the decision is almost always more useful than waiting for a forecast that was never going to arrive anyway. And that brings us back to the second question we opened with: why the safest-looking moments tend to collapse the hardest. The answer is calm itself, quietly manufacturing the conditions of its own unraveling, exactly as Minsky warned decades ago. If this masterclass changed even one decision you are about to make, subscribe to the Book Vault and drop a comment naming which force is actually running your hesitation right now: the forecast you should never trust, the invisible fracture, the two-number trick, the story premium, or the weird tax. Name it, and you've already done the hardest part.